Mark Smith, a 42-year-old truck driver, had built his life on discipline and routine. His tall, broad-shouldered frame and grizzled demeanor reflected years of long hauls and solitary nights spent navigating the endless highways of the American landscape. For Mark, the open road offered clarity, a place where he could exist unbothered by the complexities of human relationships. That night, however, something disrupted his usual sense of order. After a grueling 14-hour drive, Mark pulled into a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was dotted with rigs, their massive cabs illuminated by the faint glow of overhead lamps. He parked his truck, a faded red Freightliner, and settled into his cab. It was a ritual he had perfected over the years, shutting down the engine, brewing instant coffee, and flipping through the static-riddled channels on his portable radio. He preferred these moments of solitude, the sense of being apart from the world while still observing it from behind the thick glass of his cab. As he leaned back in his seat, eyes scanning the lot through the haze of his half-empty coffee cup, something unusual caught his attention. A young man, likely in his early 20s, approached a neighboring truck. The man's appearance struck Mark immediately. His clothes, a leather jacket and worn jeans, seemed too deliberate for someone working or traveling. He moved with an air of confidence that felt out of place in the utilitarian world of truck stops. The young man paused briefly at the passenger side of the truck and knocked softly, a sequence of quick taps that seemed rehearsed. Mark stiffened, his gaze narrowing. He recognized the truck, an older Kenworth that belonged to a middle-aged driver he'd seen around before but didn't know by name. A moment later, the door creaked open, and the young man climbed inside. The door shut behind him, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, but it replayed in his mind with unsettling clarity. Unable to look away, Mark's curiosity turned into a voyeuristic compulsion. The truck's faint interior light flickered on, and through the windshield, Mark glimpsed shapes and movements, subtle but unmistakably intimate. His chest tightened. The scene unfolding before him was foreign, not in its content, but in the way it invaded his thoughts. He felt a cocktail of emotions surge within him, disgust, fascination, and a creeping sense of vulnerability he couldn't shake. Mark was a man who prided himself on control over his truck, his routes, and his life. But that control faltered as he sat there, frozen, his mind racing. He questioned why he hadn't looked away, why the sight of the young man had captured his attention in the first place. The answer eluded him, leaving only the sting of shame in its absence. The next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Mark started his truck and drove off without a word to anyone. The journey home felt longer than usual, the steady hum of the engine failing to drown out the images burned into his memory. By the time he reached his modest two-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he was emotionally drained. His wife, Lisa, greeted him at the door. A warm and nurturing woman in her late 30s, Lisa had always been Mark's anchor. She immediately noticed something off about him. His usual stoicism had been replaced with a distracted air. Mark brushed off her concerns, citing exhaustion from the road, but the truth gnawed at him. That night, he turned his back to Lisa in bed, claiming he was too tired for conversation, let alone intimacy. Over the following days, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He found excuses to avoid spending time with Lisa, burying himself in chores or disappearing for hours without explanation. Lisa, ever patient, tried to give him space, though her concern grew with each passing day. She couldn't know that her husband's silence wasn't the product of work stress, but rather the aftermath of a moment he couldn't reconcile with his own identity. Mark Smith's struggle with himself began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it soon grew into a consuming storm that disrupted every facet of his life. The man who once found comfort in routine and control now felt trapped by his own mind. The memory of that brief encounter at the truck stop had taken root, spreading through his thoughts like an invasive weed. Mark's frustration was not only with the scene he had witnessed, but with his own reaction to it. For a man like him, raised in a culture of rigid masculinity, even acknowledging curiosity about what he had seen felt like a betrayal. Over the following days, Mark became increasingly restless. He avoided spending time at home, retreating instead to the anonymity of dimly lit bars. These establishments, with their sticky countertops and faint smell of stale beer, provided a strange solace. Here, he could blend into the crowd, nursing his drink and losing himself in the white noise of muted televisions and idle conversations. Yet, even in these moments, his thoughts would wander back to that truck stop, replaying the details in relentless clarity. He hated himself for it. Mark's absences did not go unnoticed by his wife, Lisa. She had always been attentive, quick to sense when something was off, but Mark deflected her concerns with a practiced nonchalance. He blamed the strain of long hours on the road, assuring her that he just needed time to decompress. But the truth was far more complicated. At night, when he returned home, he would slip into bed long after Lisa had fallen asleep, careful to avoid even the chance of conversation. The intimacy that once defined their relationship now felt like a distant memory. By the end of the week, Mark's pattern of avoidance had solidified. His guilt was compounded by anger at the young man who had approached the truck, anger at the driver who had let him in, and, most of all, anger at himself for not looking away. This anger festered, hardening into a resolve that he couldn't fully articulate. He began to fixate on the idea of right and wrong, drawing sharp, uncompromising lines in his mind. What he had witnessed was an affront to his values, he convinced himself. It was a disruption of the order he so desperately clung to. When his next assignment came through, Mark seized it as an opportunity to escape. The road had always been his refuge, a place where he could leave everything behind and focus solely on the miles ahead. As he loaded his truck and prepared to depart, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But beneath that relief was a simmering tension, a sense of purpose that went beyond the simple task of delivering cargo. As Mark drove, the memory of the truck stop resurfaced, sharper and more vivid than ever. He replayed the scene in his mind, dissecting every detail. His thoughts turned darker, fueled by the unresolved anger that gnawed at him. He began to imagine scenarios in which he could intervene, taking action to set things right. The idea of confronting such behavior appealed to him, not because he cared about morality, but because it offered an outlet for the emotions he couldn't understand. By the time he reached the halfway point of his route, Mark had made up his mind. If he encountered anything like what he had seen before, he would not sit idly by. He would act. The thought gave him a strange sense of control, a way to reclaim the authority he felt he had lost. What he didn't realize, however, was that his anger was not truly directed at the strangers he blamed, but at himself. Every mile he drove brought him closer to a confrontation, not just with others, but with the man he was afraid he might be becoming. Mark Smith returned to the same truck stop where everything had begun just a week earlier. The familiarity of the place, the arrangement of rigs under dim security lights, and the quiet hum of idling engines stirred an uneasy sensation in him. He hadn't planned to stop there again, but his route had dictated otherwise. As he parked his Freightliner in a far corner, away from other trucks, the air inside his cab felt stifling. Despite the late hour, sleep eluded him. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, his mind replaying the scene he had witnessed during his last visit. The memory felt sharper in the stillness of the night, as though his thoughts were amplified by the surrounding silence. Mark clenched his fists, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He told himself that if anything similar happened this time, he would act. He rehearsed scenarios in his head, imagining himself confronting those who crossed a line he had drawn for the world but never for himself. The thought of taking control offered fleeting relief, but beneath it was a discomfort he couldn't ignore. He didn't know what he was more afraid of, seeing it happen again or realizing that it might stir something within him. The knock on his cab door came suddenly, breaking the stillness. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was soft but deliberate, and he immediately knew who it might be. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it, hoping whoever was outside would move on. But the knock came again, this time slightly louder, and his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. He opened the door just enough to see a young man standing there. The figure was illuminated by the faint light spilling from the truck stop's lamps. He looked to be in his 20s, with sharp features and a confident posture. His attire, a fitted jacket and jeans, was casual but carried an air of deliberate style. There was something disarming about his presence, a mixture of ease and assurance that unsettled Mark. Without hesitation, the young man made his proposition, his voice low and smooth, almost hypnotic in its delivery. Mark's first instinct was to slam the door shut, to shout at the intruder, or even grab the tire iron lying on the passenger seat. His anger surged, not just at the man but at the situation itself, at the audacity, at the disruption of his carefully maintained world. Yet, as he gripped the edge of the door, something stopped him. The man's presence was magnetic, and Mark found himself unable to act. His anger gave way to confusion, then to something far more dangerous, curiosity. The moment felt surreal, as though it were happening to someone else. Mark hesitated, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts. He knew he should push the man away, send him back into the shadows from which he had come. But the allure was undeniable, and the control Mark had prided himself on for so long began to slip. Against every instinct he had built over a lifetime, Mark stepped aside, allowing the man into his cab. What followed was a blur, an experience that defied everything Mark thought he knew about himself. He couldn't explain his actions, nor did he try to. For the first time, he allowed the emotions he had buried to surface, and they overwhelmed him. The night passed in fragmented moments, each one more disorienting than the last. When it was over, Mark sat alone in the dim light of his cab, his thoughts a chaotic mess of guilt, shame, and a lingering sense of longing he refused to acknowledge. Before the young man left, he handed Mark a small slip of paper with a phone number scrawled on it. Mark accepted it without thinking, his hand closing around the paper as though it were a lifeline. He watched the man disappear into the darkness, his silhouette fading among the rows of parked trucks. Mark remained motionless for several minutes, the silence around him deafening. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark started his truck and pulled out of the lot. The slip of paper was still in his hand, its edges crumpled from the pressure of his grip. He wanted to throw it out the window, to rid himself of the reminder of what had happened, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he shoved it into the glove compartment, where it would remain out of sight but never out of mind. The road ahead felt heavier than ever, each mile a reminder of the night he couldn't undo. Mark tried to focus on his route, on the mechanics of driving, but his thoughts betrayed him. What he had done, what he had allowed to happen, was something he couldn't reconcile with the man he thought he was. The weight of it pressed on him, threatening to crush the carefully constructed identity he had spent years maintaining. Mark Smith returned home after his latest haul with a forced sense of normalcy. The small, tidy house he shared with his wife, Lisa, stood in stark contrast to the chaos that now consumed his thoughts. As he stepped through the front door, he was greeted by Lisa's warmth and an unexpected announcement: she was pregnant. The news should have filled him with joy, and on the surface, it did. He managed a smile, embracing her as she shared the details with excited anticipation. But beneath the surface, Mark felt an oppressive weight. The revelation of impending fatherhood clashed violently with the secret he carried, one that had begun to define him in ways he refused to acknowledge. Mark tried to focus on his new role as a future father. He made an effort to engage in conversations about baby names, nursery plans, and doctor appointments. During the day, he maintained the image of a devoted husband, the kind of man who took pride in providing for his family. Yet, every moment spent with Lisa was a reminder of the gulf that had formed between them. His thoughts drifted constantly to the slip of paper hidden in the glove compartment of his truck. The young man's phone number felt like a physical link to the part of himself he couldn't confront, a part that now haunted him. At night, Mark's internal conflict deepened. While Lisa slept peacefully beside him, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the events of that fateful night, not as a distant memory but as a vivid, living moment that refused to fade. He tried to rationalize his actions, to frame them as a mistake or an aberration, but the more he thought about it, the more complicated it became. He found himself questioning everything he believed about who he was and what he wanted. Each night, he retrieved the crumpled slip of paper from his jacket pocket, staring at the hastily written digits as if they held the answers to his turmoil. He never dialed the number, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it either. Lisa, ever perceptive, began to notice the changes in her husband. Mark had always been a man of few words, but now his silences felt heavier. He seemed distant, distracted during conversations, and quick to find excuses to leave the house. She chalked it up to work stress, believing that his long hours on the road were taking a toll. Mark did little to dissuade her from this assumption, leaning on the familiar narrative of exhaustion to deflect her questions. Her trust in him remained intact, even as he withdrew further into himself. As the weeks went by, Mark's behavior became more erratic. He avoided Lisa's touch, citing fatigue or early mornings as reasons to keep their interactions brief. He spent more time in his truck, tinkering with minor repairs that didn't need to be done or reorganizing tools that were already perfectly arranged. These tasks gave him an excuse to stay away, to be alone with his thoughts. In those moments, he felt a fleeting sense of control, even as the truth gnawed at him. Mark's isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He found himself retreating from the world, withdrawing from friends and colleagues who had once been a part of his routine. Even the open road, his longtime sanctuary, no longer offered solace. Every mile he drove felt heavier, the weight of his secret growing with each passing day. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, scanning every truck stop and roadside diner for any sign of familiarity. The fear of running into the young man again was matched only by the strange hope that he might. The double life Mark was leading took its toll. By day, he was the picture of reliability, a man who went to work, provided for his family, and prepared for the arrival of his child. By night, he was consumed by doubt, guilt, and a longing he couldn't define. The dichotomy between these two versions of himself created a pressure that he knew couldn't last. Yet, he carried on, driven by the belief that he could somehow compartmentalize his feelings and maintain the life he had built. Lisa's pregnancy became a focal point for Mark, a way to ground himself in reality. He attended appointments with her, painted the nursery, and even allowed himself moments of genuine excitement. But these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the ever-present conflict within him. He knew that the life he was building with Lisa was at odds with the part of himself he had discovered, a part he couldn't erase no matter how hard he tried. As Mark sat alone in his truck one evening, the slip of paper clutched in his hand, he realized how fragile his facade had become. The double life he was leading wasn't sustainable, and he knew it. The question wasn't if it would unravel, but when. For now, he kept moving forward, each day a delicate balancing act between the man he was and the man he feared he might become. Mark Smith's next route took him back to the same truck stop where everything had started. The tension in his chest grew with every mile closer he came to the familiar sight. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles whitening as he replayed the events of his previous visit. The slip of paper, still hidden in his glove compartment, felt heavier than the cargo he was hauling. He didn't know what he was looking for, but the compulsion to return was undeniable. It wasn't just the pull of curiosity, it was the need for resolution, an attempt to make sense of what had unraveled his carefully constructed life. When Mark pulled into the lot, he immediately noticed the difference. The usual hum of engines and the scattered glow of interior cab lights were replaced by an eerie stillness. Police cars lined the perimeter, their red and blue lights flashing rhythmically in the dark. Yellow tape cordoned off part of the parking area, and uniformed officers moved methodically, speaking in low voices and taking notes. Mark parked his truck at the far edge of the lot, his curiosity morphing into unease as he observed the scene from a distance. Stepping out of his cab, Mark lit a cigarette and approached a small cluster of drivers gathered near the diner. Their hushed conversation and grim expressions told him that something serious had happened. As he got closer, the fragmented pieces of their exchange began to make sense. A young man's body had been found behind one of the trailers, beaten and left to die in the cold night air. The description matched perfectly, the sharp features, the leather jacket, the confident demeanor. It was him. Mark's stomach turned, and his breath quickened as he pieced together the details. The boy had been a regular at truck stops like this, offering companionship and discretion to drivers who were willing to pay for it. But there was more to the story. Rumors swirled among the drivers that he had been blackmailing some of his clients, threatening to expose their secrets if they didn't meet his demands. One of those clients, pushed to the brink, had decided to silence him permanently. Mark remained silent as he absorbed the information. His thoughts raced, a torrent of conflicting emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The young man who had thrown his life into chaos was gone, his secrets buried along with him. The relief Mark felt was quickly eclipsed by guilt. He couldn't help but wonder if his presence in the boy's life, however brief, had contributed in some way to his fate. He would never know the truth, and that uncertainty settled over him like a shroud. As the hours passed, the truck stop slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the air remained heavy with tension. Mark returned to his cab, shutting the door behind him and leaning back in his seat. His eyes fell on the glove compartment, and after a moment of hesitation, he opened it. The slip of paper was still there, crumpled and worn from his constant handling. For a long time, he stared at it, the weight of its significance pressing down on him. Finally, he made a decision. He rolled down the window and, with a steady hand, let the paper drift into the trash bin near his truck. It was a symbolic gesture, one that he hoped would bring him closure. But as he started the engine and prepared to leave, he realized that throwing away the number didn't erase the memories or the questions that lingered. The boy's death had severed the only connection to a part of himself that Mark was still struggling to understand. As Mark drove away from the truck stop, the miles stretched out before him, endless and unyielding. He tried to focus on the road, on the steady rhythm of the engine, but his thoughts betrayed him. His mind returned to Lisa, to the life they were building together, and to the child they would soon welcome into the world. He told himself that this was what mattered, that his family was his priority. Yet, as he glanced into the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection, eyes weary, face etched with doubt. In that moment, Mark understood the truth he had been avoiding. No matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles separated him from that truck stop, he couldn't escape himself. The road ahead offered no answers, only the promise of more questions. And as the horizon blurred into the fading light, Mark realized that the journey he feared most was the one he would have to face within.